I'm Luke Pearson. I've done a bunch of stuff in InfoSec. The key point here is that I've worked 52 discrete incident response engagements. And when I say incident response engagements here, I'm talking an attacker's gained interactive access to an environment. So it's not a user clicked on a phishing email and nothing happened because AV called it and things like that. It's the attacker's actually gotten in and they've started doing stuff. Super quick show of hands here. Who's worked one of those engagements in the past? Attackers got into an environment. Maybe 20%? Okay, cool. There'll be value here for you too, I promise. So a super quick disclaimer here. I've worked with some of you in the past and you may go, hey, that example looks exactly like my organization or what we worked on together. It's not, you're wrong. Please don't sue me. This is the Secrets Group. The Secrets Group is an escrow company. Basically, they take secret information. It could be contracts, it could be source code, it could be whatever you want, and they store it on behalf of their customers until an event takes place, and then they release it back out. Super simple network. I'm sure you've all seen something like this before. Basically, what the attacker is going to do, just to put this into context, they're going to do some cred stuffing against the SYS service here, which isn't super protected. They're going to move into the business users subnet and work through the workstations there as they do. Jump into the Active Directory server and do some shenanigans. Some of you can imagine what those are. Pass through the internal firewall, jump onto the secret storage network and deploy some ransomware because bad guys are going to be bad guys. So they start with credential stuffing. And the way this software as a service solution is set up, and this could be anything that's out there. I'm sure you've all played this game before. Some internal IT unit needs to stand up a service really quickly, so they pay an external company to do it. They link the AD server to it because single sign-on is so much easier than anything else, and away they go. What attackers will do is identify these services and do credential stuffing attacks. So they'll take previous password dumps with usernames and passwords and try them against that service. Because typically that service is configured that if you try, for example, 3 times, it won't lock you out of the internal AD because your internal AD will allow 4 or 5 attempts before locking the user account out, which is just to prevent denial of service against that internet edge. But it also reduces your visibility. Your users are never going to complain, hey, my account's locked out, I didn't use my password wrong, because they come in the next day, they sign back in, and it resets that account. We protect against that with two-factor authentication. This is standard stuff. I'm sure you've all seen this before. You attempt to sign in, you get a message on your phone, or you plug in your YubiKey and press the button, or you read a number off an RSA token, or what have you. You want to implement this against any cloud services or external-facing services because it's external-facing. The attacker is going to be attacking it. It's high fidelity to employ it there. But you also want to try and employ this against any of your highly privileged accounts or any services that are privileged, like the secret storage network that we were looking at earlier, and your domain admin accounts and things like that. All your really high fidelity stuff should be protected by 2FA as well. Unfortunately, the Secrets Group did not do this, and the attacker got a few accounts. These accounts didn't actually allow the attacker to VPN in, which is what you'd usually see. They find valid credentials against an internet service, so use those credentials to access the VPN and come in that way. It didn't work, so they fell back to their tried and true sending a phishing email. Red teamers in the room, and red teamers that I've spoken to in the past have said if phishing emails are part of scope, they're allowed as part of the engagement, then they're getting in every time. They're always going to get that initial access, and attackers do the same thing. So how could we protect against that? No-brainer, right? Disable macros. This is within your Office suite. Don't allow .docms to execute. A little bit of tongue-in-cheek here. Analyze your own organization first. Make sure that you don't actually use macro-enabled Word documents within your organization or spreadsheets or what have you. It's worth noting here too that Microsoft is trying to do this for you. So earlier this year they pushed out a change that said no more macros, and then they rolled that back because there were some unintended consequences. But they're trying to get there anyway. What that means for us as defenders is that attackers are going to be pushing into this space really hard because Microsoft's going to take that vector away. So you're going to see an uptick on this before it goes away. If you want to get ahead of that, disable your macros today or after you've done your analysis. The other thing that we can do is train our users either not to open the emails or when they do to report it. Sorry, there we go. So you can do your phishing sims, and a lot of organizations will have, every year we have our users do 1 hour of cybersecurity training. That's enough, we've ticked our compliance box. A lot of studies have shown that that's not enough. You get a lot better results if you have that initial training so users understand what's going on, and then you have constant reminders. You put some posters up in the hallways that they see every day, just constantly reinforcing the message of long and secure passwords. Don't share them. Hey, if you see a log on screen that doesn't log you into anything, you should probably report that. Also, make your training and your internal security culture to be rewards-based. So if a user forwards through a legitimate, as hard as this is to say, a legitimate phishing email, you know what I mean, they go into the draw for a Amazon gift card or a chocolate bar or a shout out on your internal security page once a month. A lot of users really enjoy that kind of thing, and if you turn it into a, hey, thank you for reaching out to security, good job, here's a reward, instead of, hey, you open that phishing email, slap on the hand, bad you're going to get much, much better results. Your users are also the most comprehensive IDS system you have in your network, because they're using your network every day. They're also relatively cheap from an IT security point of view. Chocolate bars really, really affordable. So encourage them to reach out to you, encourage them to work with you, and you might get some alerts from your users for bad activity much sooner than you would relying on your IDS or whatever it happens to be. But the secrets group didn't do that. So the attackers got a foothold onto one of the business units' laptops. Let's say it's Luke in reception. Luke in reception has opened a phishing email, and the attacker has code execution on one machine. Luke's not an administrator on this machine, so the attacker needs to escalate his privilege. He wants to get up to local administrator or system, and he wants to start looking around the network. The attacker does this via group policy, which sounds a bit weird. Why is the attacker using group policy, and how are they doing it on a workstation? Basically, what happens here is the secrets group is setting a long and secure password per workstation, so it's unique for every workstation in the environment, which is really good. Sounds fantastic. Unfortunately, they're doing that by pushing a script to each workstation via GPO, and it takes an MD5 of the hostname. And the hostname's not a secret. The attacker can find the hostname of any machine across the network relatively simply. And because the script is pushed via group policy, it's stored in sysvol on each workstation, and it's not protected. So the attacker checks out this directory. They find this script to see how local admin for every local administrator throughout the network is set, and now they can emulate that. If they want to get to Ethan-PC, for example, they run MD5 across Ethan-PC. They know its local administrator password. That allows the attacker to move through the network. Because you can RDP through or do code execution or whatever it happens to be. So we protect against that by having unique passwords for local administrator accounts, which the secrets group kind of had. We're not going to set them via group policy. LAPS, or the Local Administrator Password Solution, the secret is in the name there, it is the solution for local administrator password management, is free, it's built into your Active Directory of domains, and it's relatively easy to set up. You want to disable remote logon for local administrators. There is no reason for /administrator to need to log on over the network. Your IT administrators and your service desks should have their own discrete user accounts they're using to access their machines and do administrative stuff anyway. And the local administrator account can be I have to walk to the machine and punch it in to gain access to fix whatever's broken. The other thing you want to do here is enable host-based firewalls. This will prevent an attacker from using common protocols like RDP, SMB, WMI between different workstations in the same subnet that aren't protected by sort of a network firewall or a layer 3 firewall, as it were. The advantage here too is that you can set it so that your internal service desk can RDP into machines to fix them or use whatever protocols they need, but you disable that workstation to workstation communication. This is going to be really, really effective against ransomware as well, because a lot of ransomware that has worming variants built in will use SMB to spread throughout a network and hit everything. If you have your internal firewalls enabled and you're blocking SMB, it prevents that lateral movement vector, and it makes the attacker sort of move outside the wheelhouse a bit. The other thing we're going to look at here too is logging. And before we look at logging, we have to talk about dwell time. So dwell time is how long an attacker is in your environment before you detect them. It's not before you kick them out, it's not before remediation is completed or anything like that. It's just how long before you can start the incident response process. As you can see back in 2011, and this is all based on Mandiant's point of view, this is from a M-Trends report in 2022 from Mandiant, 416 days, which is nuts. For context there, a lot of red teams that I talk to say they can go from internal breach to domain administrator, which is I can do all of the things on the network, within about 3 days on average. So that's a lot of time for the attacker to be moving around. Fast forward to 2021, we're down to 21 days on average, which is excellent. 28 of those days, down from 73 in 2020, is just a whole lot better. It's still your attacker in your environment for 4 weeks. They've had 25 days, in theory, of domain admin, if they're as good as your standard red team, to move through your network, but it's a lot better than 416 days years and years ago. Why does this matter? Because this informs how long we retain our logs for. If we retain our logs for 14 days and we only find out about an incident 28 days after the attacker has been in, it's really, really hard for us to work out how they got in, what they did before that logging was enabled. So this is really just to inform the discussion with your manager going, well, how long do we need to keep these logs for? Logs are expensive, you know, they take up disk and all that. This gives you numbers and metrics to say, on average, it takes us 14 days to complete incident response. On average, we think that we will receive an external notification, so we're looking at 28 days on top of that. We should be looking at retaining our logs for at least, maths is hard, 42 days. The other thing worth calling out here too is our external notification between 2020 and 2021 went from 73 days down to 28. Well done, security community. You know, we're talking to each other, we're lowering our barriers and everything, and we're helping each other out. No, we're not. Ransomware actors are reaching out to you and going, hey, we've compromised you, pay some ransom. So that metric's a little bit skewed, unfortunately, but we can improve there. Okay. What you hear a lot with logs is, man, they're expensive. I have to import them into a seam, I have to pay someone to manage my seam, I have to pay for the ingestion and the storage and everything else. You don't need a seam for logs to be useful. And a lot of the breaches that I read back through when generating this talk, the client-server compromise ratio, so workstations to servers, was 4:1 on average. And Windows defaults to 20 megs of event log storage per event log on your workstations and servers. The workstations that I looked at on average through an organization had 100 gigs of free disk space. So that's a lot of disk. You could take 20 log sources, make them a gig each, and your users would never know the difference. The argument here, of course, is, oh, an attacker can delete those logs, so what's the point in capturing them? And there's a couple of arguments to that. Attacker's not necessarily going to delete them, and we'll talk about why that is in a couple of minutes, but they're not necessarily going to get all of them. And if an attacker does delete the logs, generally, it will create a brand new event ID saying, hey, these logs were deleted, and it gives you a lead for something has happened. But you can then search the rest of your servers and workstations and go, well, I know that this attacker deletes logs. Let's see other servers and workstations that have deleted logs, because that tells me the attacker's probably touched them. And I've got a brand new set of servers and workstations that I need to go and investigate. All right, so I said 20 gigs of logs, and a lot of security administrators systems administrators look at me funny and go, but we've got application, we've got security, and we've got system. Well, what other logs are there in a Windows system? Those are the big three, right? No. This is default out of the box within Windows 10. Not all of them are enabled, and full disclosure, not all of them are useful. If you're not running Hyper-V on your workstations, there's probably no point in enabling the Hyper-V logging, for example. But some of them are fantastic. You've got PowerShell logging, which we'll talk about. You've got RDP logging. All of the logs that your attackers are generally going to create noise in, you probably want to be capturing and retaining for a lot longer. Here's an example. This is a pretty simple one where an attacker has installed a service in the system. This comes from the system event log, and it says event ID 7045. We can see the service name is a bit weird, and we can see the service itself is eventually calling PowerShell, loading a bunch of base64 into memory, and doing some shenanigans. Yes, as an incident responder, I need to analyze that further, but it immediately looks suspicious to me. The key takeaway for this one too, or one little tidbit here, is that if you see a service name of 16 or 32 characters, uppercase, lowercase, random strings, think Metasploit and think Cobalt Strike Beacon. I've done that with all of my engagements so far, and I haven't been wrong yet. Okay, we have our authentication. If a user is going to, if an attacker is going to log into a system, they're going to authenticate, and it's going to generate logs, generally speaking. So we have our logon type. This could be the user was at the keyboard and typed in their username and password. A different type, that's a 2. A 3 is a batch script ran under the context of a user, and the user account has to log in to run the batch script. And we have type 10, which is someone logged in via RDP, or over the network, but interactively. We have where they came from. So if I didn't know where they came from previously, I now have a new machine that I need to go and investigate, and a new IP address as well. And then we have the user account that logged in. So if I didn't know which account was compromised, I can then go and look for other activity from this account as well. But we also have a logon ID. And this is just a random value that is random for the time frame that the computer has been up. So if 3 user accounts log into the machine and the machine's not rebooted at any of those times, these will always be unique. But if I log into this machine and then the computer restarts and I log in the next day, there's a very small chance that these will collide. So just be aware of that caveat with that one as well. But this tells me when the user account logs in. If I search for that logon ID, this tells me when the user account logs out. So as an investigator, I can now go, I don't have to look for the entire lifetime of this machine. I have a very defined window of start activity and end activity that I'm looking for bad stuff in, which really helps for your investigations. Alan talked yesterday about collecting your PowerShell logs and doing threat hunting and finding things that are running overnight and things like that. This one, probably not super useful. This is PowerShell v2 event log, and it just says someone did something with PowerShell. By contrast, this is a PowerShell v5 event. And this says, hey, this is the command that was executed. And if you drill down a little further, it was, hey, this is the script that was run. It takes the entire contents of the script that was executed, logs it into Windows event logs. If this was base64 encoded, like we saw in the service earlier, it will unbase64 encode it, or base64 decode it, and then it logs it. So it saves you that step as well, which is pretty cool. And then if that calls additional scripts, then those additional scripts get logged. So doing a review of these logs, I can tell exactly what was executed on the machine, which is really cool. And then we go a step further. Thanks, Microsoft. Now these these PowerShell logs aren't stored in the event log, they're stored in plain text on disk. You can enable them via group policy, and these are transcription logs. So this tells you when the process started, it tells you which user account spawned the process, and if they were using run as to try and hide what the compromised account was, it shows you that as well. So great transparency there. We can see the machine it was executed on, so if you're doing central management, you can track that back to an individual machine. You can see the binary that was executed, what the process ID was, what version of PowerShell was launched. You can see when each individual command starts. You can see the command that was executed, and this is the same that we saw before. Most importantly here, you see the response the attacker gets back. So if this was a list of compromised user accounts, or compromised service accounts in this case, I immediately know which accounts I need to go and do further investigation on, which is fantastic. The key to this event log, though, is this log type, is remembering that you have it enabled. I worked an incident where a customer had been compromised and they found the PowerShell scripts in their event logs like we saw before, and they went, I wonder what kind of accounts were compromised by this. What do I need to be looking at? So they ran the script on the production machine because they needed to work out what was fed back. And it didn't work. And because it didn't work, they went, oh, I can see what went wrong here. So they fixed the script, and then they ran it again. And then all these user accounts got sucked back out to the attacker infrastructure because the attacker's script hadn't worked, and they moved on because this is one of those public exploit things. So remember that you have these logs if you choose to enable them. Otherwise, they're useless to you. And then there's SYSMON. Now, SYSMON is fantastic, and I'll give you a sec for this one. The key here is that every arrow that you see joining 2 boxes is a SYSMON event that will get logged into your event logs. Now, SYSMON's not enabled by default out of the box. You have to download the binary from Microsoft and then push it out, typically via group policy or however you choose to, with the config to capture this stuff. And because of the granularity here, a new process was spawned, a file was touched on disk, a process talked to another process. It's going to be really, really noisy, so you're going to have to really build out your space for retention of these logs and tune them to what's valuable for your organization. What's cool here too, though, is that Riley talked about DLL injection yesterday. Event ID 25, one process is tampering with another one. Event ID 10, one process is accessing another one. We'd see that in the event logs. So if this was more malicious, like LSAS, which is where your passwords are stored in memory on running systems, was being injected instead, we have that additional context. Okay, so the attacker has moved through the business users, they've compromised a bunch of machines, they've got persistence and everything else, they're like, I need more passwords. So the attacker jumps across to the domain controller, and they run Mimikatz. For anyone who's not aware, Mimikatz is effectively a credential stealing and credential reuse tool. A domain controller is where all of your passwords and credentials are stored. So you combine those two things and we're having a really, really bad day. Talking to a manager here during one of these engagements, they said, the attacker ran Mimikatz. I said, yep. I said, that's not built into Windows, is it? He says, nah. He says, what if we just prevent attackers from running attack tools in our environment? We've done it, team. Security is solved. I poke fun here, but a few years ago, application whitelisting was touted as this is how we're going to solve security. As you will probably know, it hasn't quite worked out that way. This is the Task Manager, and within Task Manager on Windows 10, you can create a dump file of pretty much any process you want, as long as you're, as a standard user. And if you want to take a picture, you can probably work out one of my test passwords there. It may be password 1234. So there are tools built into Windows, and you can't block the tools that are built into Windows because that's going to break Windows from functioning. But it doesn't have to be. Andrew talked a bit yesterday about code signing not being a panacea. This is PropDump. This is a tool that's put out by Microsoft. It's part of the sysinternal suite, and attackers love this tool because they can do the same thing as here. They can dump LSAS, for example, which is where credentials live in memory when a system is running, take it back to their attack machine and run Mimikatz on their attack machine where there's no application whitelisting and get the credentials out. And it's signed by Microsoft. So a lot of the times you'll see application whitelisting rules that is, if it's signed by Microsoft, let it run, just so we don't break anything, which is fair. But it's not a fantastic rule because you've got workarounds like this. Okay, so there's a bunch of arguments for why we don't implement application whitelisting. It can be wicked expensive, it can be fantastically complicated, and the one I hear the most is, if I can't do it everywhere, why do it anywhere? And there are some arguments to that. The problem with application whitelisting is every time your application changes, depending on how you build your rules, every time your application changes or signatures change or versions get updated or patched and things like that, you have to build a new rule for it, and that causes things to break, it adds overhead for your teams and things like that. Applications don't turn over as much on servers, so just deploy it to your servers. Or attackers are always going after domain controllers. Just start with your domain controllers. 5 servers out of your entire fleet? And you can really mitigate what your attacker is able to do, or slow them down, or generate a whole bunch of noise. The idea behind pretty much all of these recommendations today: slow the attacker down, make them think, give you more chances to catch them, more chances to respond to them before they get to the end goal because you're slowing them down. And application whitelisting can be fantastic for that. If your attacker is used to running Mimikatz every time they compromise a system or a domain controller, and you don't let them do that, they then have to test something. Maybe they go back to a lab and they build a domain controller with application whitelisting and they work things out, which takes time and gives you a chance to catch up to them. Or they test in production. They build a script and they run it on your server in the hopes that it works. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but you're increasing the noise they make. You're taking them outside of their comfort zone, you're slowing them down, and it increases your chances to catch them. And that's really the key here. The other thing that you want to do here is formalize your service agreements with your MSPs. Let's say this domain controller was managed by the MSP and your team couldn't RDP into it. Or you could, but the physical server is in a data center that's managed by an MSP, and you can't just run in there and pull the power to it whenever you need to because of a security incident. what I hear a lot is, hey, we have this MSP, they're pretty good, they do what they need to by us, and whenever we call them and say, hey, we need help, they drop what they're doing and they help us out pretty quick, which is a fantastic relationship to have with your MSPs. Until something like WannaCry hits. When WannaCry hits, all of this MSP's customers are ringing them up and going, hey, we've been hit, we need help. They get overwhelmed and they can't help everybody. What this does is basically put you at the front of the line. It sounds mercenary and it sucks, and it means other businesses aren't necessarily going to be getting the care they need, but as your security professionals for your current employer, it's your job to look out for your current employer. So build a SLA into your agreement that is, if we declare a security incident, you will assign a tech to us within 2 or 4 hours, or whatever your organisation decides that you need. Just formalise that into a contract, because it gives you some additional protections when things go kaput. But the secrets group didn't do that. So the attacker has moved through the environment, they found where the secret network is, and they found that there's a firewall in the way. This firewall had a vulnerability. The attacker found the vulnerability, they pushed a new firewall rule that says, hey, allow RDP through to the super secret network from one of these compromised machines, and then they RDP through and break through. How do you protect against that? How do you protect against vulnerabilities? You patch things. Now, I was walking around the mall the other day, and I noticed that patching isn't as cool as it used to be, which is a real shame. This is as true for people wearing pants like this as it seems to be for our system administrators. Patching is hard, it breaks things, it affects uptime, and the fixes to all of these things are just track your release cycles. Any Microsoft system administrator will be able to tell you that Microsoft pushes patches on the second Tuesday of every month. It's not a secret, it's not a surprise, there are some out-of-band patches, but you can plan for this. So when these patches get released, create a standard process, and that process does not have to be patch everything the day the patches come out. Push to 10% of your workstations and 10% of your servers, see if anyone complains, see if anything breaks. If it doesn't break, push it out everywhere else. Work within the timeframes that your business needs, but balance the risk of not patching, and possibly more importantly, understand the risk of not patching. A lot of managers in particular, and I've used this trick a couple of times, will say, well, all of my business objectives are uptime. And when I patch things, occasionally they go down, and that affects uptime. And you say, that's cool, completely understand that, you own this service, whatever. Can you please put into an email that you understand that this may allow an attacker to move through, or denial of service, your service, and you're accepting the risk of not patching? You personally are accepting the risk on behalf of the business of not patching? What you'll find most of the time is when you ask for that email, you can work out a process to get these patches in place. It might take a bit of time, you might have to do it after hours or whatever, but patches start getting deployed. The other thing that you want to look at here too is config review. Ollie talked about this yesterday with code secrets and accounts and things like that, but it's very true for your appliances as well. Permissions creep over time, you add new firewall rules and you don't delete old ones when services get decommissioned and things like that. You want to be looking at creating either a hard or a soft expiry on rules that are allowed through the firewall, and you should be doing allow-based exceptions rather than deny-based exceptions. So work on an allow list rather than a deny list. Document why your rules exist. Even if this just points to an internal change in your change tracker somewhere, it means that when you're off doing something that is way more amazing than managing firewalls, because everyone wants to get there, the person that comes behind you doesn't have to pester you every 10 minutes to go, why does this rule exist? They can just look it up in their internal change system. We had a case a while ago where an appliance was saturating a 1 gig link every day out onto the internet. Security teams immediately, oh, this looks like, data exfiltration. For a few minutes every 7 p.m. 7 p.m. every day, this 1 gig link is being saturated for a few minutes with data headed out to the internet, which sounds terrifying. What we found through investigation is that someone had configured example.com as a syslog recipient for these appliances. So example.com was resolving, syslog is being shipped out to the internet somewhere, and the recipient is actually the one that notified us and went, hey, we don't want your syslog, cut it out. Configuration review would catch this kind of thing. Yeah, that was a fun call. So the attacker, the secrets group did not patch the internal firewall, and the attacker has moved through to the super secret network, the secret storage network. The idea here is twofold. They're going to steal all of the data so that they can blackmail us. I pay blackmail, or we're going to release it to the internet, and they're not going to leave anything behind. So they're going to deploy ransomware so that we can then pay to get our secrets back that way as well. Because why not? You've got to make the most of this access. But they only came in via RDP, so how do they get the data out? There's a really cool feature within RDP where you can push the printers and the clipboard from your client machine through to the server that you're RDPing into, or the machine that you're RDPing into. This means that if an attacker finds a folder that's interesting, they can right-click copy on that folder in the RDP workstation, right-click paste on their attacker's machine, and boom, data goes out over the internet, which is cool. It can also do that with printers. So if clipboard sharing is disabled, they can send the printers from their local machine through to the destination. They open up a PDF on the destination and say, I want to print this to the PDF. I want to print it to Microsoft Print to PDF redirected for, which is actually the PDF printer on my attacking machine. Saves it to the desktop on my attacking machine. Data has left the network. It's fantastic. What we found through one engagement is, hey, a driver for one of the printers on the attacker's machine doesn't exist on the server, and we can't install it because we don't have that level of permission. And this event log got generated. And every time the attacker RDP'd into any other machine, they had this configuration enabled, and we could really quickly work out every machine the attacker had touched because that's their actual host name captured in that event log, which is really cool. The solution, of course, not necessarily to the extortion, there's not a lot of solutions to that, but the solution to ransomware is to implement backups. Implement backups that are offline, because if you leave them plugged into the machine, the attacker's just going to ransom them too. Make sure that they're offline or they're read-only so that the attacker can't change them, and make sure that you're testing your backups. There have been too many, more than 0 cases, where an attacker has been encrypting backups for the last 3 months because they've read your backup retention policy that says, okay, I will store 3 months worth of backups or 1 year worth of backups, and then at 1 year and 1 day, so they spend 3 months or a year encrypting the backups, and then at 1 year and 1 day they encrypt everything else because your backups are all completely hosed. If you're not testing your backups, you're never going to catch that, and if you're not testing your backups, I like to assume that they don't exist. So, I mean, it's not rocket surgery here. Backups has been around as a recommendation forever. Okay, so we move into remediation. We understand what the attacker did. We understand how they've compromised this entire environment, the accounts that are compromised, the systems that are compromised, the services that have been installed. We rebuild a whole bunch of machines. And we do this over what's called a remediation weekend, typically. You disconnect the site from the internet, if the business will allow you to do it. You disconnect it from the internet. And the idea here is that when you rebuild Luke's machine and the attacker still has access to Ethan's machine, he doesn't use that access into Ethan's machine to re-compromise Luke's machine, which has been rebuilt and clean. So you disconnect the site from the internet, the attacker no longer has access, rebuild everything, reset all of the passwords, blow everything away and basically start again. And that's the plan. And we did it. Happy days, right? Part of that plan too is we take all of the IOCs that we've captured as part of our incident response, so the domains that the attacker's calling out to, the systems, the services that are dropped on disk, maybe some of the accounts are created with new ones and the old ones are left so that we can log if the attacker tries to come back into them. And we build detections for that. So if the attacker tries to beacon out to the same C2 or use the same account that they compromised previously, we get an alert that says, hey, the attacker has come back. So we've done that, everything's rebuilt, it's clean, it's shiny, happy, happy days. And then a couple of days later, one of our IOCs goes off. Hey, one of our internal systems is trying to beacon out to one of the C2s that the attacker was using previously. It's not good. How'd the attacker get back in? It wasn't phishing. You start investigating. It took us a couple of days, and one of the employees that had been on leave during the incident response process came in and said, oh, when you disconnected the internet, did you disconnect the backup internet link? We looked at our documentation and we went, don't see a backup internet link. He says, yeah, it's just here. It's right there. He pulls it out of his drawer. I'm sure you've all seen this in the past. You've got that documentation that lives in the engineer's drawer. You pull it out, it's not quite what lines up with your expectation. So that's what the attacker did. As we were cleaning up, the attacker was planting a couple of brand new backdoors and forgot to change one of their C2s. We catch a trigger on that, and basically you start your incident response again. The way to fix that is to document stuff properly. Make sure that all of your networks and your interconnects are documented. All of your endpoint details, the versions that you're running, where your applications are installed, where your application installers and licenses live for that remediation as well. Super, super important. And what external resources you have available. So if something blows up really quickly, how do you reach out to your MSP? How do you reach out to legal or law enforcement or PR or whoever you happen to need during incident response? Document all of that out. Document out playbooks. So typically what I like to do is have playbooks for activities that I don't do frequently as part of my day-to-day, but I expect to do as part of incident response. Deploying new EDR agents or new security appliances, for example, especially if you're working with a third party who's going to bring them in and just drop them for incident response engagements. Isolating part of your network to stop the attacker from moving through. Like maybe we need to isolate the secret network, the secret storage network, sorry, whenever we think we've been compromised to make sure the attacker can't get in there or they can't exfiltrate data because we've caught them. Document all this stuff out. Once you've documented them, test them. Do a tabletop, do a dry run, because version 1 is never going to have all of the steps that you need to implement a playbook correctly. Version 2 or 3 might be getting pretty close once you've tested them a couple of times, but you'll always be missing stuff in version 1. Also document out your incident response activities. So building out a timeline is absolutely fantastic for understanding how an attacker moved through an environment and putting discrete events into context. Document out the hosts that are compromised, document out your host-based indicators like services that get created, user accounts that are created or compromised, things like that. Network-based indicators, IP addresses, domains, credentials the attacker uses, directories the attacker uses, all that kind of stuff. And then any evidence that you collect as well. So you take a forensic image of a hard drive because you think it might go to court one day or because it's more valuable to you, document that out sufficiently that if it goes to court, then you've got the documentation ready, because you never know when it's going to go that way. This is the incident response tracker that's published by CrowdStrike. It's a spreadsheet, so it's super complicated to use. And it's free. Anybody can jump in and download it, and if you've never done incident response before, it's worth dragging into a tabletop so you kind of get an idea of what kind of data you should be collecting and preserving there as well. That was the end of the secret script. I'm torn here between being lighthearted and being a bit more serious. Studies have shown that up to 50% of businesses that experience this kind of compromise are still trying to recover from that impact 3 years later, which I can read two ways. Either 50% of businesses don't exist after 3 years, or 50% of businesses bounce back. It's not clear, but 50% are still impacted. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens in Australia in this space, because you've got your Optuses and your Medibanks and places like that that have been compromised. The long tail of that will be really interesting to observe as well, because those are much bigger companies than your SMB type places. Finally, these slides will be available there on the 5th of December. Thank you very much to all of you for your attention and laughing in the right places. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much to Hack Sydney for hosting the conference, and to the AV crew out the back, although you may not thank them because it means you could hear me the entire time. Any questions? I say, stealing your thunder.
If you have any questions for Luke, we do have time for a few questions. It'd be a great chance to pick his brain a little bit. Just pop your hand up and the mic will come to you.
I clearly explained everything really well, and you're all just either ready for lunch or ready to go back and implement some changes. Oh, maybe one way at the back.
Thank you very much, Luke, for the wonderful presentation about the whole journey of the hacking that is company. So I'm interested in Could you please elaborate more about the storage of the syslog? Just how can we store those logs to a secure place? Thank you.
Sorry, the question is around how do you store your different event logs for use?
Store the logs for later analysis. Since the attacker may delete all those logs, and also you also mentioned that the Windows log can be deleted, right?
Yep. Yeah, so you can centralize them either into a seam, or you can set up like Windows event forwarding just to a bucket or a host or something to catch them before an incident starts. If that's not affordable though, just enhancing the logging on your workstations is going to give you a lot visibility further back, but as we said, the attacker can delete those. So that would be before an incident started. If you want to preserve event logs once an incident's already kicked off, it really depends on what your incident response process is. You can deploy tools. Kanza is a PowerShell suite of tools, I suppose, which is really good at, you can give it a credential, you can give it a list of workstations, and it will jump out and collect all of the event logs from all of those workstations and pull them back, and it can pull back a bunch of other like forensic artifacts and things as well. It's a really powerful suite of tools. But if your internal incident response process is to engage your third-party provider, if you've got retainers with your Mandiants or your CrowdStrikes or whoever it is, then you're basically going to do what they tell you to do, which may be to deploy an agent and they'll collect it themselves. It may be they give you a specific Kanza script to run. It really depends on what your internal process is going to be, and it's not something that we can answer generically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, thanks. Thanks, Luke.
Excellent. Do we have another question? We've got time. There we go. Time for one more.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Luke. Great presentation. You touched on the end there the importance of making sure you're documenting your IR process and testing your tools. Definitely very important, but also kind of boring. I was just wondering if you had any recommendations on how do you make sure that you're going through that process and maintaining not just your documentation on your tooling, but also testing it to make sure that's working.
Sure. So, especially for documentation with as-builts and things like that, as a security guy, I farm that out to the internal team and make that their responsibility to keep in charge of, because I don't like doing it either. For the playbooks and stuff that I actually care about though, or the things that I'm responsible for, first couple of iterations sucks. I pull down a template off the internet and I tweak it to our environment, and then we do a tabletop, which can also get kind of boring, especially when it's not really tailored for you. After you've done those first couple of iterations though, you really want to test them in a more live fire environment. If you have the capability to spin up a small lab and reach out to your pen testy friends if you have them, or that one internal security guy that's totally a pen tester, we all know that guy, get him to compromise that lab, and then actually use the playbooks in production. Start spinning them up and executing them and working out where they fail. What I like to do is build them out so that I can hand them off to the service desk or hand them off to the interns or somebody that's not me. And then I can go, hey, this system is compromised or this user account is compromised. This is the playbook, fix it. And then I can move on with the tracking down the hacker and doing the fun stuff. It is unfortunately still a bit of drudge work, but if you add into the excitement through something like a purple team or a compromised environment and things like that, and build testing of the playbooks into the having fun of incident response, it becomes more palatable and more realistic.
Well, thank you, Luke, for talking to us today. We are so happy to have you here. We have a thank you gift from Hack Sydney. Let's give him another round of applause.